So MPP Khanjin is the member of provincial parliament for the riding of Barrie-Innisfail. And while she was born in Moscow, her parents and she left the Soviet Union when she was only 4 years old. So she's spent the bulk of her life here, and she's attended the University of Ottawa. After graduating there, she became an advisor to the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration, and then moved on to the Ministry of Finance. She's become a senior policy advisor in the past to Ontario's leader of the official opposition. And so she comes with a whole host of experience behind her. Andrea was elected to the Legislative Assembly in 2018, and congratulations to you, MPP Khanjin. That's a fantastic feat. Following that election, the Premier named her as the Parliamentary Assistant to the Minister of Environment, Conservation and Parks. And this is a really critical role that we're looking to be able to leverage and work with, certainly at the new ministry in the Ontario government. Ms. Khanjin's priorities include securing funding for local infrastructure, healthcare and education, and of course protecting Lake Simcoe and delivering on the government's commitment to making life more affordable for all Ontarians. What I'm going to do is just take a minute here to highlight to people some of the efforts we've been putting forward at the Ontario government. Two big initiatives in our work with the Ontario government. One is over with Mr. Fideli's office at the Ministry of Economic Development, Job Creation and Trade. That's where we've had a $10 million R&D funding program operating for the last 4 years. Several of our members, including eCamion that you heard from this morning, have received funding from that program, which has really spurred over 100 jobs in Ontario from industry academic collaboration in low carbon smart mobility. So we're currently lobbying to have that renewed with Minister Fideli's office, and we're excited to be able to put that forward as a green recovery economic initiative. And so stay tuned, in particular if you're a member of QTRIC, as you'll be brought into that effort. But our second big initiative, which we're hoping to talk to MPP Khanjin about today, is of course our Mississauga bus project, our hydrogen fuel cell bus project. And that is a project that we've been active in advocating for over the last 4 years in the city of Mississauga, in particular in the last 2 years with Mayor Bonnie Crombie advocating for the deployment of 10 fuel cell electric buses in Mississauga. It would be what we call the hydrogen homecoming, bringing hydrogen buses back to Canada, given that they are innovated in large part here through New Flyers operations in Manitoba, given that the powertrain has Ballard fuel cell stacks, given that Hydrogenics also supports hydrogen fuel cell stacks out of Mississauga, as well as the electrolyzer system that is operational right now with the Hydrogenics electrolyzer in Markham with Enbridge natural gas. So that provides clean and green hydrogen to the Ontario heavy duty landscape, although right now there are no heavy duty vehicles absorbing that hydrogen supply. So those are the two big things that we've been putting forward to the government of Ontario. We understand that the government of Ontario will be releasing a hydrogen strategy in upcoming months in alignment and building on the strategy that the federal government is initiating. So it is a good time for hydrogen, and it's definitely a good time to bring hydrogen electric buses back to Canada, since the last time these things were trialed was over 10 years ago in BC during the Whistler trial. And as we know, the technology is innovated extensively, and now we have a huge job creation opportunity around green hydrogen. For those transit agencies that are struggling to go to green hydrogen right away because there is a low supply chain at the moment, there is of course steam methane reformed hydrogen available out of Sarnia, out of Quebec, out of other jurisdictions in Canada. And while not a perfect green solution on day one, it is a lower carbon solution over the life cycle than diesel propulsion has been shown to be, based on our modeling at least. And so what we're working with the Ontario government on is a plan where we could theoretically see fuel cell buses come out the door, get deployed in the city of Mississauga, possibly use steam methane reformed hydrogen in the short term, but moving very quickly to green hydrogen produced from the grid. So those are two of the larger initiatives. Several of our members have helped us in that regard. And as we move into this larger dialogue, of course, the Ministry of Climate Change and Conservation is going to be key and critical to that effort, as is the Ministry of Economic Development, Jobs, Creation and Trade. So on that, I believe we may have MPP Khanjin joining us now by audio.
All right, thank you so much. And you know what, technology will solve the environment, but sometimes on speaking, we have to be a little bit patient. So thank you everyone. And thank you, Yosefa, for the introduction and bearing with us.
Not to worry. So over to you, MPP, because in the interest of time, we want to give you as much time as possible to articulate your message to our participants. So we'll turn it over to you, and you've got the virtual microphone.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, everyone, for standing by. I do bring greetings.
Yep, and we can now see you and hear you, so it's wonderful.
Okay. Perfect. So I do bring greetings on behalf of our Environment Minister, Jeff Urick. He's the Minister for Environment, Conservation and Parks. He's also wanted me to pass along his congratulations to the Canadian Urban Transit Research Innovation Consortium on this first ever Canadian Smart Rail Technology Conference. I also want to thank QTRIC both for inviting me to speak with you today, as well as your ongoing work and development of solutions that will help create a healthier and more prosperous Ontario. I love people that are solutions-based, and it's great to see all the masterminds here that are, of course, investing their time and energy to create better solutions and environments at the end of the day. As we all know, rail played a very important role in all parts of our life, including connecting Canadian people and the Canadian province. And certainly it made Confederation possible by enabling, I should say, the transportation of goods and people across large distances. My community of Barrie Innisfil, we have an interesting history with the railroad, of course, because we're surrounded by many lakes, and certainly the Canadian Pacific Railroad, to be specific, as well as the first development of steam rail really helped in terms of connecting, whether it was Lake Ontario or Lake Simcoe and Lake Huron, certainly had an incredible role to play in that context. So it's great to be able to build on that today. And a lot of that was thanks in large part to many organizations that had formed since its early days, and organizations like today with QTRIC and its members who want to, of course, talk about zero carbon transportation technologies and how we can increase those today and then in the near future. So I'd like to talk about the different ways Ontario is working to foster the advancements in your industry, because as we know, technology constantly changes. And that's a big, big importance for us in terms of changing our environment plan and keeping it flexible as technologies change as well, and as we gain more research. So I did want to provide you with some information in terms of how we're reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, and we want to meet our targets. The target, of course, is in our Made in Ontario Environment Plan, which is our blueprint that we want to keep building on when it comes to addressing things like litter and waste and, of course, climate change. And interesting to note that about 80% of our greenhouse gas emissions, as many of you may be aware, is from the transit, building, and industry sector. And those are sectors all where hydrogen can play a very, very large role. And as I mentioned, because our plan is evolving, we're looking to all sorts of different actors and energies that can play a role. I know we relied heavily on nuclear for a very long time when it comes to creating a clean energy grid. And as a result of the closure of the generating station back in 2001, and it was obviously coal-fired, we were able to make massive gains in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, it was something like 30 megatons, which is the equivalent of getting many vehicles off of our roads. And so since then, we have to look at other technologies that can play that role as well. If you look at our Made in Ontario Environment Plan, you'll see that we are committed to reducing our emissions, our greenhouse gas emissions, by 30% below the 2005 levels by 2030. And of course, we're on that path, and Ontario certainly played a significant role when it came to reducing all of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions, and we're well towards that target. To help us get to that target, what we laid out in our environment plan is also emissions performance standards. And so what that translates into is we want to be able to go after our larger emitters and be able to hold them accountable. And it's also plays as a policy nudge effect, right? I mean, at some point, you're not going to have large emitters wanting to pay huge costs, and they might look at alternative energy sources of how to power their machinery or their transportation vehicles. And so it's very exciting that we're talking to you today when you're looking at alternative ways to power things like buses and rail and all those exciting projects. And so certainly you want to make sure you do this in a very mindful way. And so our emissions performance standards have been approved by the federal level, the federal government. And so in that, you may see, and you may have heard over the last years as we've been going back and forth of discussions that with the federal government, that a lot of what we want to do is also not stymie economic growth, right? So as much as we want to make sure the big polluters pay, and we do that nudge effect of getting them maybe to use cleaner technologies, we also being mindful of the economics of this. And certainly COVID-19 has presented an additional economic challenge, but we could also treat it as an opportunity, right? In terms of investing in things like hydrogen and green infrastructure, things that will, if we invest in it today, it's going to pay dividends tomorrow, not only in a clean environment, but clean jobs. And certainly economically, it's going to also make a significant impact. I know maybe many of you who watch the markets or may tune in CBC Disruptors. One of the things they had mentioned is the use of hydrogen and the role it can play. And I know also Bloomberg also went into detail, and we mentioned it in our discussion paper on hydrogen, the fact that, according to Bloomberg New Energy Finance, it estimates annual global sales of hydrogen could reach 700 billion by 2050. Obviously, that's going to, a big contributor to that will be government policies. So when it comes to our government policies in terms of cleaner transportation fuels, a key commitment we make, of course, includes reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector, as I mentioned, which generates about a third of Ontario's greenhouse gas emissions. So we are proposing, as a province, to begin transition to higher renewable content when it comes to gasoline in the coming years, without, of course, increasing our prices at the pumps. And we also want to, in light of COVID-19, the minister and I are looking at the potential for clean tech and the hydrogen sector to help the economic recovery and, of course, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So this past spring, the minister and I met with sectors as a part of the government's a working group called the Ontario Jobs and Recovery Committee. It's something the Premier asked all ministers to embark on. And so the government, we've heard a lot of ideas coming from the sector, and we currently have a discussion paper we recently released outlining Ontario's first ever hydrogen strategy. So we're looking for your input on that. The discussion paper, if you're looking for it, it's been posted to the Environment Registry for public comment, and certainly it'd be great to get your feedback, as we do want to hear from yourself and anyone you know that's interested to help us shape the development of our low carbon hydrogen sector. And interesting to note that many of those chemists and the science folks on the call today know that hydrogen is the first element on the periodic table. So it's great that it's getting much deserved attention, as it was quite popular dating back into the 1960s when it was looked at for things like space travel. And in the 1970s, it was also used as an alternative energy concept during the oil price crisis, of course. And now we're back at it coming at 2020. And so I think the future looks quite bright in terms of, when it comes to increasing things like the decarbonization with the production of hydrogen. And of course, building on that infrastructure for cleaner transportation vehicles by using hydrogen. So what you'll see coming forward on this discussion paper and on this policy specifically, is you'll see we'll be releasing a hydrogen strategy in 2021. This is very complementary to what other provinces are doing as well. As you know, Quebec and BC are both working on a hydrogen strategy, and Alberta is committing to doing one by 2023. So it's certainly an up-and-comer to look out for. And certainly we'll be interested to hear your feedback as we get along. But as we continue, on this path of the hydrogen transportation sector and how it relates to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, one thing is very clear, and many of you will recognize that, and that is low carbon hydrogen is versatile, and it can be a clean fuel alternative or a complement to fossil fuels like coal, natural gas, diesel, and gasoline, which is why it's so crucial for us to start looking at it seriously and get the conversation started among sectors. One area where hydrogen has really great potential over the long term is, of course, transportation. As hydrogen presents, ample opportunities to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in transportation, and hydrogen fuel cells, of course, can become a cost-competitive solution in the transportation sector. Depending on the fuel cell costs, as well as the availability of fueling stations, but certainly has that potential. And hydrogen's also been identified as a leading option to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for long distances and long-haul road transportation. It could be cost-effective globally by 2030, which is probably why you see many other countries, South Korea, Germany, Switzerland, just to name a few, that are all taking investments in the hydrogen sector. Of course, Canadian technology is already at the forefront when it comes to hydrogen and rail, but there's certainly more to go. And fuel cell development by Ontario-based hydrologists, I should say, which of course we've seen locally in Ontario, was acquired by Cummins, and they're being used in Germany they've been used in Germany for about over 40 regional trains powered by hydrogen. So it's really great to see that Ontario success story. And certainly that's something we want to build upon. And when it comes to building on the use of hydrogen in Ontario's rail industry and of course in our transportation industry, currently you'll see that through our GO Train, GO Rail, I should say, expansion program, bidders on Ontario corridor work projects have the opportunity to propose innovative approaches to meet future GO Transit rail service needs. And you'll hear more of that through the Minister of Transportation. But that's obviously a window of opportunity, both for the economy and the environment. This also includes opportunities for technology that can be used to electrify core segments of the GO Rail network, and including, of course, hydrogen fuel cells. Our province, in addition to that, is also interested in identifying and supporting technologies and business models that can use cost competitive low carbon hydrogen in ways that allows us to leverage those investments that have already been made in decarbonizing our electric system. So many of your priorities line very well in line with ours as well. In the hydrogen discussion paper that I had outlined to many of you, of course, that's the beginning of the conversation when it comes to our transit network. So again, I encourage you to lean in and give your feedback on that as well. And of course, if you haven't given a read, do give it a read. Again, I want to thank you all for listening. There's a despite what's happening in the world today, this is something very positive to look forward to. It's an opportunity for the sector and for all of Ontario and of course our environment. And as the global pandemic has hit us and created unprecedented challenges, we can also look at the positive elements like we have here today. So on behalf of myself and Minister Jeff Urick, I encourage you all to participate in our discussion paper. And I'm really excited that this is the first of many conferences I'm sure you will have. And I'm looking forward to meeting in person one day and all of your feedback and your advice. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, MPP Khanjin. That was fantastic. And you spoke at a speed and a cadence so we could get it all in. And we still have a few more minutes for questions, if you don't mind, if we can exploit your knowledge and expertise, because you outlined a picture that is essentially music to our ears, a real awareness of the hydrogen sector that we've been working towards for the last several years. And right before you were able to join, I had articulated that we've been working on a hydrogen fuel cell bus project in Mississauga for several years now. And of course, we'll be bringing that back to the ministers as part of the hydrogen strategy in Ontario. But if we may, there's a few questions, and we've got a few questions just on the application to rail. And perhaps you can give us some guidance on where you think your government might be going, or some of the questions your government might still have in mind. One of them is earlier this morning, we had Phil Verster join us from Metrolinx. And of course, we've all been talking about the application of hydrogen to rail. It's a low emission, zero emission solution for long distance rail. But as Phil Verster articulated, when they went out to tender, essentially none of the manufacturers and providers of the services could come back with a price point that was comparable to our traditional diesel vehicle systems, right? And that makes sense because it's of course new and innovative, and so it's going to cost more. And therefore the question is, to the extent that the government is willing to co-invest, is your expectation that the hydrogen strategy would have subsidization or co-investment supports, or is the expectation that the hydrogen strategy will really focus on high-level targets but not necessarily have investments tied into it? The sense being that unless there's dollars to overcome the cost differential, at the end of the day, we can say we want hydrogen all we want, but it's just more expensive right now. It'll eventually be less expensive, but it's just more expensive right now. So what can we expect in the rail sector or from the hydrogen strategy from the government of Ontario in terms of whatever you can give us a sense of direction there? Oh, and we've just lost you. 1 second, MPP Khanjin, you're just on mute. So I think you've got your phone. There we go. No, we've lost your audio again. Let's give it one more try. I think your phone is on mute because you've got your audio on your phone. If you don't mind, you may have, that phone may have just been muted. There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
we can. Okay.
Yeah, we
Okay,
can.
excellent. I was going to say it's the meaty part of the discussion. So no, it's a great question. It's one of the reasons I wanted to highlight that statistic from Bloomberg, the fact that, you know, if they're predicting that potential investment in future, that potential investment from the private sector needs to be matched with obviously the direction that the government's going to, because we've been at this crossroads before, which I'd mentioned to you, you know, back in whether it was the 1960s or 1990s, where hydrogen sort of popped up and was gaining popularity, but then there was sort of a stagnation again, and again it's gaining that popularity, which is a good something that RBC Disruptors also mentioned on one of their podcasts, which I encourage everyone to listen to who's interested in the sector. And so that's why we're starting this dialogue. I think this is the beginning of a longer strategy. That's why, you know, we're looking to other provinces that are following suit, and of course other countries as well. You know, by 2040, hydrogen is expected to become a cost-competitive, low-carbon solution. And so that's very appealing to all governments. For example, when it comes to steel and cement production, there's a lot of cost savings there. So I think the first step, and you'll see a lot of the questions in our hydrogen discussion paper, is really actually to ask your sector, what is it that's needed, whether it's reducing some of the regulatory burdens that are sort of stymieing hydrogen from being a huge potential solution maker, and then also the necessary investments that are needed to be made by the government. We just released our latest budget last week. But there's going to be another one coming in March. So there's certainly some potential there. But I would say we can't go with those investments yet until we solve all the kind of the solutions to the questions in our discussion paper. I think that's step number one. So we are in this the solution for the long term, because we see the success in it from our government. I see the great potential in it. But we do need help from all sector experts to really get us going when it comes to answering some of these key component policy questions. So there's a slew of them at the back of our discussion paper. So it'd be great to get your feedback, and then we can go to next steps when it comes to other investments, transportation and infrastructure wise as well.
That's great. And we'll make sure to harvest all of that feedback from our members and ourselves to furnish you with that information. The next question that we have comes out of an ongoing dialogue we've had at several sessions, not just at this conference, but in the lead up to this conference, which is essentially on the transportation side. You know, once COVID passes, obviously COVID's destroyed transit ridership, but not necessarily for the bad. I mean, if people end up working from home, that could be a good thing for congestion overall. But the concern is, of course, what we've already seen, which is congestion comes roaring back. People get into their cars, and we just know, like, you know, at the end of the day, we're not able to open up our cities, and GDP will suffer if people are stuck on highways not moving. So we got to get people out of their cars and into rail and into transit services. From your perspective and your government's perspective, and especially your ministry's perspective, what can we expect from the government of Ontario in terms of encouraging people to get out of their cars and into rail or subways, given that you know we are pumping a lot of money in Ontario into subways and LRTs and streetcars and all sorts of great things, but we actually have to motivate people to leave their cars behind to solve that problem. So can you take us through what that narrative in future looks like?
That's an excellent question. I think that's it's good. It's a good question, because when you're at the Ministry of Environment, you have to remember that it's not just the Minister of Environment that cares about environment and green energy solutions. It's also the Minister of Transportation. You've got your Minister of Housing, Minister of Businesses, et cetera. So the way we're taking this approach as a government systemically is getting all of our different ministries to lean in when it comes to ideas for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and creating that kind of, you know, better green economy, right? In our last budget, our provincial government sold the most amount of green bonds, which is actually, you know, that didn't get much coverage, but it's in there. And so that leads to, you know, how do you get more people, especially in the situation we're in now, to take more transit? And so I think you need to look at some of the policies that had happened before COVID-19. For example, it starts at a young age, right? Habits, we all learn habits at a young age. So something the Minister of Transportation did, and I'm sure she may touch on it, but it's things like free transit for for kids under 12. It's like free transit to key Ontario historic tourism sites. So again, that's the Minister of Tourism working on it being interested in transit, saying, you know, Minister of Transportation, can you provide free transportation to these historic landmarks like Ontario Place, like Science Center, you know, provide that for kids for free? Because, you know, if you're a family of four, what's the incentive to take transit? It's easy to pile in your car, but why should I get on that train or bus, right? And so this is kind of creating that public policy incentive from a young age for families. Again, creating that sort of nudge approach in terms of public policy making to encourage them to do that. But it's also things like making it convenient. Wi-Fi, I know it may not be an environmental solution, but it's a pull factor. So you have to think of all those pull factors that get people on our trains and our buses. If I don't have to be behind the wheel, and I can be on my laptop working on my speech for Q-Trick or working on my, a public policy document, that saves me, that saves me time, and I can get more work done. Or I could spend it talking to my kids if they're going. I don't have kids, but when I do, sending them off to school, if I'm on the train, I can talk to them, et cetera. So it's that, again, that quality of life that people like. They want, one thing that government can't buy people is time. But you can create other public policy solutions that make it more appealing. Like, this is how we will, save you time behind the wheel. And that will encourage more people to take transit. And the other big factor is, of course, the Minister of Transportation is investing in these huge subway projects, which is a huge economic booster. In my backyard of Barrie Innisfil, we have DCAST, which creates molding for a lot of these transportation projects. So you have to remember, they're creating, the concrete cement blocks for transportation. So they're helping get more transportation built. But at the same time, they're using technologies, which if they were to use hydrogen instead of other technologies to make that concrete, is also investing in, say, the technological sector, doubling down on hydrogen. So not only are we doing hydrogen in our physically, how transportation moves, but how it's built and all those bricks and mortar tools that lead up to the building of the subway. So it's all very complementary, and I'm so glad that you're connecting those dots.
Well, and I'm really glad that you brought in the whole Wi-Fi thing. This has been a horse that I've been beating dead for at least a decade, which is it's such a pull factor, right? Not just productivity, but making our life on transit connected, seamless, convenient, cheaper, more efficient, all of those things. So you've definitely sung the tune to a great melody that we all would like to sing along with. Your knowledge and your expertise demonstrate themselves. And MPP Khanjin, we really want to thank you for being here and for serving in your role. It's an important one, and we're looking forward to feeding into the hydrogen strategy so that we can collaboratively get this technology out on the road, so to speak, and get those green jobs, because goodness knows after COVID, we need jobs across the province and across the country. So for any last comments, I'd like to turn to you for any last comments you'd like to make to our audience, given that we're all looking at, well, what is the province going to do going forward to pull us out of COVID and create a green recovery and help transit going forward?
Yes, certainly. I mean, one of the reasons we came back and your legislature is in session and still sitting is because if we don't talk about these measures today, if we don't pass transit bills now, some people may say, well, what does that have to do with COVID? But every change we make today is going to lead to a better post-COVID recovery, because that challenge is so much greater now. And the other thing I wanted to leave you with is we need your expertise. Government can never do it alone. If you look at all the great successes, many of which I named today, they were in partnership with the private and public sector. And I think it's the role of I fundamentally believe, and much of our government, shares these convictions, is that it's the job of government to push, the private sector businesses forward and to do what we can to help you thrive. And so not to get in your way, but to allow for that platform. So I do call on you for your consistent feedback, dialogue, input. There's many ways to do them. And I look forward to many more of these conferences. And I'm glad to be a part of history today on your first ever conference.
Thanks so much. We really appreciate your time, and congratulations to you, and good luck to your government going forward. Stay healthy and stay safe.
Thank you so much. Have a good one.